In this video, we're going to review the quadratic formula. And before you attempt to do the quadratic formula, just make sure you're comfortable with simplifying square roots and manipulating equations. If you don't know how to do either of those, right, just talk to me and we can talk about it before you do the quadratic formula. All right, so we talked about factoring quadratics. You can always solve an equation by factoring and kind of breaking it down into its parts. But what do we do if we can't factor? Really, the only other option is to do the quadratic formula. All right, and the quadratic formula is super useful because any quadratic you have, again, quadratic just means there's that x squared. Any quadratic you have equal to 0, the solutions are always given by this formula. All right, so just like knowing how to factor using the splitting method is important, the quadratic formula is just one of these things you have to memorize because pretty much every math class you take after this one will expect you to know the quadratic formula. So we're going to talk about it a bunch, but just get it memorized because it's always going to be useful. All right, so here's the first example. On that last slide, I just noticed I had this equals 0. So that's the first thing we always have to do. We can't use the quadratic formula unless we have an equals 0. So let's do that first. All right, we're going to subtract 2x from both sides. All right, and here's a mistake I see people make a lot because you subtract the 2x, you just kind of write it at the back. Like that. There's nothing wrong with that. All right, you subtract the 2x, you subtract it at the back. But when you go to use the quadratic formula, it's always an ax squared plus bx plus c. So we always have to write the x squared first, and that's our a. Then we always have to write the x term second, that's our b, and that's our c. So the mistake here would be a lot of people would say 7 is b because it's in the middle, but really I have to rewrite it like this first. And now that it's in the proper order, now this is a, this is b, and this is c. All right, so make sure you're always writing in that order of kind of descending powers of x, x squared, x, no x. But now that I know that, I can do the quadratic formula. The answers to this equation is always the quadratic formula. And again, just get it memorized because you're going to use it for all your other math courses. Negative b, I'm going to do negative 2 turns into positive 2. B squared is going to be negative 2 squared. A is 3, C is 7. Over 2 times 3. Oops. Now the main thing you want to focus on here is simplifying that square root. This 2 out the front's not really going to do much. I'm pretty sure you can do just simple multiplication in the bottom. Right, but we have to simplify this square root. Here's another common mistake, negative 2 squared. A lot of people write it like this, and they type it into their calculator like this, and their calculator says this is negative 4. Right, that's not true, because it's actually negative 2 squared, which is negative 2 times negative 2, which is positive 4. Right, so always make sure when you're squaring a negative, with the negative being included in that square, you get a positive number. Right, and minus, let's see, 4 times 3 times 7 is 12 times 7. That is 84. 84. And now I can do that subtraction and minus 80. There was one time earlier in the year we would say this has no solution because it's the square root of a negative, but we have complex numbers now. So I can rewrite this as the I is the square root of the negative 1. And now I got to simplify my square root. Let's see, is 80 divisible by 16? It is. So the I is going to stay. 80 is 16 times 5. And that 16 comes out of the square root as a 4, because the square root of 16 is 4. And 90% of the time, more than that, 99% of the time, I'm fine with this as your final answer, but 2, 4, and 6 are all even, so I could actually write my final answer like this. Like that. Right. Just kind of divide everything by 2 to make the numbers a little bit smaller, but I would never take off points for that answer. This is the quadratic formula. Let me just again talk about the common pitfalls before we move on. 1, make sure you write your answer in the appropriate order, so you actually have A, B, and C correct. Make sure whenever you're squaring this b squared, you're always getting a positive number. All right, so that number should be positive right there. And then just make sure you're simplifying your square roots as much as possible. 80, we're looking at those perfect squares. 25, 36, and so on. All right, any of those perfect squares divide this number, we have to simplify our square root. All right, so those are all the kind of common things you have to be careful of when you're doing the quadratic formula. All right, one more example. I'm going to go through this one a little bit quicker. We know the common pitfalls now. Subtract 3 from both sides. Oops. Now we know A, B, and C. It's written in the correct order. Right, then we're going to go to the quadratic formula. I'm not going to rewrite it. So it's going to be negative b is going to be negative 7 plus or minus square root of b squared. It's going to be 7 squared minus 4 times a c all over 2a. Okay, first big thing, simplifying that square root. 7 squared is 49. 4 times 6 times 3 is 72. And that should be positive. All right, so it's another common mistake. Negatives, 2 negatives make it positive. 72 all over 12. And 49 plus 72 is 121. I want to simplify our square root. In this case, it simplifies really nicely. The square root of 121 is just actually the number 11. And a lot of people finish here because you've simplified the square root as much, but this is a special case. When the square root completely goes away, you can actually get down to 2 number answers. All right, so my first answer, all right, the plus or minus, again, is just shorthand for saying there's 2 different answers. So one answer is if I choose the positive. Negative 7 plus 11 is 4. I get 1/3. The other answer is if I choose the negative. And I get negative 3 over 2. So make sure if the square root completely goes away, you actually get down to those 2 numerical answers, because chances are, if this goes away, these are much simpler answers than kind of this double answer in one. All right, so here's one for you to try on your own. All right, solve this quadratic equation using the quadratic formula. All right, show the answer in 3, 2, 1. And after moving things around and doing the quadratic formula, you get this answer here. All right, either answer in this bottom line is fine. Again, if you don't kind of simplify to get these smaller numbers, I'm fine with that for the most part, because there's a lot of mistakes happen when people try to do that too much. Over here, 2, 2, and 6 are all divisible by 2. So if I do that, I get a simple answer, simpler. All right, so quick summary. I use the quadratic formula to solve any quadratic, so it's super powerful. Always get 0 on one side of the equation, and always make sure you're writing them in the correct order. All right, and make sure to fully simplify, all right, using I and your perfect squares.